What's up, gangsters? How about a little tool review? Because I got some new stuff right here on my bench that I'm pretty stoked about. You guys, if you've watched any of my stuff, you know that my inner tool whore is pretty obsessive about sanding materials. I just can't resist. Whenever I see some new cool sanding stuff, I kind of have to try it out. And that's what I have. Matt Bull over at Hobby World USA got some new supplies in from the good folks at Infini. They also make the super cool Infini cutting mats. If you haven't ever seen them, they are pretty swanky and very useful. Here's one of them. You can see it's basically a hard plastic template with laser cut grooves that makes it easy for you to cut tape to exact shapes and sizes. And apparently they've decided to do sanding materials as well. And so when Matt told me that, he told everybody in Scale Modeler's critique group, not just me, I'm not special. Anyway, he told us that he was carrying these. I immediately wanted to check them out. So that's what we're going to do. And as usual, I can't just stop with just checking one thing out. I'm going to sort of compare them to my whole pile of sanding stuff. So let's get right into it. Okay, so here we go. This set of sanding materials consists of two different sort of product lines, I guess. One is what they call their soft back sanding sponge stick, and you'll see why. And then they have the basic, just plain old sanding sponges. So the sponges are pretty self-explanatory. They are just sheets of sanding material on a sponge back. Not a particularly revolutionary concept, but a very useful one. And they come in grits ranging that go in steps: 220, 400, 600, 800, 1000, and 1500. Which is cool. That's a nice progression. And I immediately like the fact that they've got the grit written right on there. The only thing that would make this better, and I honestly just don't understand why these sanding materials people just don't get this, would be if the grit was written all over this thing, like every half inch or so in small letters. Because what's going to happen is most likely, if you're like me, you're going to end up cutting this thing into smaller pieces and using it for other things. And of course, as soon as you do that, you don't remember what grit exactly that one little piece is that you cut off of this corner over here, because it doesn't say anything on it anymore. What I do usually is just write it on the back so that I can keep track of it. But it would be great if they would just print it all over their sanders. But these guys are doing a better job than anybody else I know of. I'm going to show you some other sanding materials that don't have it on there at all. So hey, I guess we're moving in the right direction, and I shouldn't be an ingrate. But hey, we always want what we want, right? So anyway, same thing with these. Softback sanding sponge sticks. And I'm going to just whip one of these packages open here. And I kind of like the packaging. It's got this sort of flap on the back of it that I think, in theory, if you're not clumsy like me, lets you just open it like that and slide it out. So there we go, 400 grit, and you can see that it's the same on both sides. And the reason that it's called a softback sanding sponge stick is because it's the same basic sponge material that they have in sheets that's sandwiched on either side of a stiffener. So it's not super stiff, but it's not fragile either. I mean, I kind of like that because you'll be able to put some pressure on whatever you're working on if you need to do that, but yet still have some contour following capability. And I like that. It's kind of a good concept. It seems like each one of the sanding tools that I have kind of approaches this differently, and it can make a big difference. I find honestly that a lot of what separates different sanding tools is the backing. And you can have two ostensibly identical sanding grits between two different sanding sticks or whatever from the same manufacturer even, and they'll behave totally different simply because of what the backing is or the stiffener that's in there. But we're going to get to actually trying these out here in a minute. I cannot talk about any sanding materials in one of my videos, though, without and talk about grits without bringing up the great grit hoax, conspiracy, fraud, whatever you want to call it. I have to talk about it because a lot of people don't realize this. Sanding paper comes in grits, obviously, and those grits are based on standards that are set by engineering organizations like ANSI, that's the American National Standards Institute, based on the average size in microns of the grit particles that are used on that particular abrasive. And they do that for really good reasons, so that when you go across manufacturers and manufacturing platforms and methodologies, you get some consistency. At least that's the theory. The problem is that it seems like every different country has their own grit standard. Japan has one, China has one, Europe has theirs, the United States has one, and they're similar, but they're all different. Now, Infini is a Korean-based company, and I have no idea if their grit standard is the same as anybody else's. If they have their own, if they're using somebody else's, I don't know. All we really know is that it is made by electrostatic induction. I mean, that just automatically sounds cool, right? Anyway, let's just take a look at how some of these grit standards compare. If you look at the American standard and you look for 400, you can see that it's about a 30 micron grit size, which makes it considerably finer than the European standard, the P400, which is, well, maybe not a huge amount difference. It's 42 microns versus 40, so that's not a whole lot of difference, but the point is, it is different. And what you find is that the further down the chart you go towards finer grits, the bigger the difference becomes. If you drop down to 800, now you've got 13 microns for the American standard and a whopping somewhere between 30 and 20 for the European standard. That might make a big difference to you. And look, some of you guys I know are already saying, why do I even care about this? All I want is to know, is it fine or medium or whatever. And that's great. If that works for you, that's cool. Some of us, like me, super obsessive about these things, and I want to know that I'm making a rational progression as I work from coarser to finer. And it just helps me sleep at night if I know that I'm going from 240 to 400 to 800 to 12 to whatever. But it's also useful when you're shopping, because if you are looking at sanders from Company A and comparing them to Company B, it would be kind of nice to know that their 400 grit sanding sticks are both equivalent. Yeah, it's probably not going to happen for you, but it's, at least that's kind of the theory. So again, you may not care about sanding grits at all. And if you don't, that's cool. But this is for those of you guys who do. So again, back to the chart. When you get down to the really fine stuff, you can see that there's, again, quite a bit of difference between, like, you've got 1500 and 2500. The 2500, even though the number would indicate that it's twice as fine as the American equivalent, or what's in the American column. The number's almost twice as big, and the grit is almost twice as large. So again, you can see that it can get kind of weird. Now, the numbers do go bigger than this. I'm going to show you some sanding materials here in a little bit that go clear up to 4,000, and I believe that they are probably, well, I don't know. I think that they are American standard, but I don't know. 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. 3M makes some stuff that goes up to 5,000, and I think you'd have to say that that's probably American standard since they are an American company. But anyway, the last thing I want to point out is this is where I get into the hoax part of it, and that's the micro mesh thing. Now, for those of you not familiar, micro mesh makes sanding cloth that can be attached to sanding sticks, sponges, whatever. And they have grits that go all the way up to 12,000. And people act like this stuff has some kind of magical properties because it has such high grit numbers. And the reason that I call it a hoax is because I kind of feel like Micromesh just made up their own grit standard with really high numbers just to make you think that you're getting a much finer abrasive than you actually are so that they can sell more. I mean, it's just snake oil, and I don't know, I just object to that. But you can see what I'm talking about because 3,200, let's take the 3,600 grit. Sounds really good, right? Well, just go across the chart here. It's only about the same as the 1,350 grit American paper. Their 3,200 is about the same as 1,200, and it's barely any finer than the European standard 2,500. And when you get down here on the 12,000, it doesn't even exist on either of the other charts. You just kind of have to extrapolate that it goes down to something like 1 or 2 microns. Who knows? I don't know if you can get finer than 1 micron. That's a pretty small piece of aluminum oxide or whatever the abrasive of choice is. Point being is, don't think that just because you spent money on micromesh that you've got something that's just a lot better than anything else, because honestly, it's not. It's just different. So anyway, with that, let's get into actually looking at how some of this stuff from Infini performs, and then let's maybe compare it a little bit to some other stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up all of these so that I've got access to all of them, and then I've got this piece of plastic from my collection of mules, and you can see maybe that it has a texture on it that's molded in. I don't know if you can tell or not. It's a pretty fine grain texture. And so what I'm going to do is go through a grit progression here and polish that off, make it nice and smooth using these materials, and just see how they perform. So here we go. First things first, got to open them all up. Okay, so here we go. I've got all 8 of the grits of the sanding sponge stick things out here, and I'm about ready to go. Now, I'm going to work all the way through these, and the reason that I'm going to do that, and I'm going to recommend that people always work through a progression of grits and do it at least in relatively small steps, is because what happens is when you start with a coarse grit, let's say 220 or whatever it is, and then let's say you jump all the way from 220 to something like 800. Well, the problem is that you're going to leave scratches that are too deep for the 800 grit material to remove. And those are going to show up at some point, especially if you're doing something like a metallic finish. And this especially comes into play when you are polishing and you get into or when you're going to polish and you get into the really fine grits of abrasive where you're moving from 1,500 to 2,500 to 3,000 to 4,000. You really have to be disciplined about making those relatively small jumps in grit so that you don't end up having to go back and redo your work because you find scratches later on. Ask me how I know. I have learned this the hard way because I'm fundamentally lazy and I want results now, and so I used to have a really bad habit of making way too large of a jump in my grits, and I just kept finding a lot of scratches. And the bottom line it was just all on me. I just wasn't being disciplined enough in my grit progression. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I'm doing normal body work, like this type of thing, where I'm going to smooth down some putty or whatever kind of filler, my normal progression that I've become very comfortable with is the coarsest thing I will use is this 240 grit UMP Finny stick. That's a good brute force material remover, but it will leave scratches. And I kept badgering Paul and Lee to make something finer, and they finally did, and I love it. Love those guys for doing it. And they now have a 400 grit series of Finny sticks, and that's what this is. And they've coated it by making it yellow, which is nice. So I generally go from the 240 to the 400, and then they have an 800, which you can see is orange, same thing. And then if I really am, I want to make sure that it's nice and smooth, then I will use the Ultimate Green Buffer. It has an even finer side, which you can use for polishing clear parts. So, and we don't know what grit this is. If you ask Paul, he'll tell you, well, this is like 8,000 and 12,000, because I guess that's what their sanding stick maker is telling him. And again, it's getting into those weird numbers that don't mean anything. But the bottom line is that whatever grit this is, and I'm estimating that it's about a 1,200, maybe 1,500, and that this one over here is maybe like a 3,000 or a 4,000. But point being is that's a progression that works pretty well for me for doing this kind of work. So I'm going to do a similar thing here, at least to start out with. I'm going to go 220, 400, and then I think I'll skip the 600 and go to the 800 so that it replicates what I'm doing with the other stuff, and then I'll go to an even finer one. So I'm not going to make you guys suffer through all of that sanding real time. I'm just going to get right to it and do a fast motion video thing or whatever, and we'll look at the results when I'm done. Sorry, I'm down here futzing around trying to get my Optivisor out. And yes, I do a lot, if not all, of my finishing work with a magnifier on. And honestly, I sometimes feel like the magnifier is the most important sanding tool I have, because without it, I would never be able to see those scratches until it was too late and I started taking close-up pictures. All right, here we go. Okay, so there you go. I think you can see from looking at this, hopefully I was able to show well enough on camera what kind of finish I got here. It's pretty good. It's what I would expect to be able to do. But I like the progression, even though I skipped a couple of steps there, because again, I wanted to do it the way that I've been doing it with my other sanding materials. And I got to what I felt like would have been a very acceptable finish at the 1500 grit level for priming. I would not have felt the need to go on to the 2500 and the 4000, but I just kind of was curious to see what it would do. And you can see I've even got a little bit of a reflection going on there with that 4000 grit. I don't know what the deal is with these 4000 grit sticks. They were like totally stuck to the inside of the package, and they stick to each other and they feel kind of sticky. And I thought maybe something was wrong with them, but it seems to work fine. I mean, he kind of wants to stick to my finger. So I was pretty impressed with that. Let's do a quick thing here. Let's say that I had a canopy, and I've got this F4 canopy that I'm not going to be using for anything. And let's say that it had a seam along the top of it, and I had used my knife to scrape the seam down, which is kind of my standard practice if I've got a seam on the middle of a canopy like that. Let's see, let me just take this off of here and let's see what it takes to get rid of that real quick. Now that's not a whole lot of a scrape there, so I'm going to just start at 800 and see what I do with that. Might even have been more aggressive than I needed to be. Now I hope you guys saw while I was doing the sanding on the wing that I was crisscrossing as much as possible. That's really important to removing those scratches, especially when you step to a finer grit. You just have to make sure that you're covering everything that you did before with the previous sander so that you don't have stray scratches. So there we go, that's pretty well covered. Let's go to the 1000 grit. For something like this where you're polishing, it's more important to make those little small steps in your progression. So for something like this, I would not skip the steps the way that I did with the wing thing that I was working on there. Okay, so that's 1000. This is 1500. And this sponge thing is pretty nice because it conforms really well to the shape of the canopy. But the one thing that I don't like is that the sponge also lets it wrap around the thing a lot more than maybe you want it to. And see, now I've got scratches. If it'll focus, I've got scratches on the sides of it that I didn't really need because, again, all I was really worried about was that seam that's on the top. And so very quickly this sanding job has become a lot bigger than it really needed to be because of that spread. But that's okay, because look, you can always polish it out. It's really just a matter of how much elbow grease you're willing to burn on the project. But that's the thing about sanding and polishing. You can always get it done. And something like polishing a canopy is really nothing to be afraid of, as long as you're willing to do the work. So that's 2,500. Let's see now what happens with this really fine thing. It's pretty squeaky. So that much work right there did not get it completely cleaned up. It gets there, but not exactly what I would want. But I wouldn't do it that way, because when I got to that point, see, I am a massive cheater, and I would just take my Proxxon with some Zam on the polishing wheel. Sorry. And there you go, just that fast. Now it's not exactly perfect and as crystal clear as it was when you started, but that's just kind of the nature of polishing. What you have to remember is that these pieces like this were made in a mold that was diamond polished by guys who do this for a living. And so you should sort of expect that it's going to be hard for guys like us to get quite as good of a polish. But you can get pretty close to it as long as you're willing to put in the work. So anyway, there you go. That's a little demonstration of using this material on a clear part. And that's really not too bad. Okay, let's wrap this up, but take a quick look at some other sanding material options and just kind of compare and contrast some of their different features. Actually, before I get to that, one thing I want to mention is wet sanding versus dry sanding. Obviously, you notice that I dry sanded all of these. And I do that sometimes. Sometimes I wet sand. It just kind of depends on what I'm trying to accomplish and how big of a job it is. The number one reason for wet sanding is to keep your paper from clogging up as much. That in turn helps you get a better finish because it keeps more of the grit exposed and you don't get big clods in there that can create gouges and scratches. So, if you've got a lot of sanding work to do, if you got a lot of paint that you're trying to smooth down or whatever, especially when you get into the finer grits like 400 and above, then wet sanding is a great idea because it will make the job go faster and better and help you get a better finish. But for major rough body work like 240 grit, that kind of stuff where I'm just working on bulk removal, I typically don't worry too much about wet sanding. I will just take the sanders and wipe them off on my sleeve, and that gets rid of a lot of the swarf that you can see. You can also buy rubber sticks that are used for removing swarf from grinding wheels and things like that, sanding belts, that type of thing, in like an industrial shop setting. I have one, but honestly, I never use it because my sleeve works so good. So anyway, just a word about wet sanding in case you were wondering. Okay, gangsters, it's the next morning and I'm going to wrap this thing up with some additional commentary about various options for sanding materials and why you might choose other things. So let's go back to the example of the little piece of canopy where I showed yesterday how I would possibly polish off the line that resulted from scraping a seam. Okay, and so I've got the other piece here, and I've done basically the same thing, which is about all you need. Now, with the sponge sticks, it wraps way too far around that thing and makes it where you basically end up polishing the entire thing as opposed to just the little area that needs attention. And I'm a big fan of only working on what needs to be worked on and not spreading things out. So what I would do instead of using a sponge in this case is I would grab one of my go-to sanding sticks because it's more rigid. All right. Now this is the 800 grit one from UMP, and because it's more rigid, it's going to basically let me focus the work right there on that area that I've scraped flat. And as long as I don't get too crazy with rocking it back and forth, it should stay relatively localized. All right. So, and yeah, you got to be careful not to make a flat spot and all of that. All right. But that's just part of the deal. You should be being careful of that anyway. So there we go. I've worked that in two different directions and got myself a relatively tight little repair. All right. So now that I've polished that with the 800 grit, what I'm going to do is, let's see, I've got this thing. This is from Flory. Okay, this is basically just like the UMP green buffers, but in a very skinny little stick with very little foam padding. Which again, I'm working on the principle of keeping my repair work very restricted to a small area. So I get in there and I do my best to work across the grain of my previous scratches. And you can already see that I'm getting some clarity back. And now I'll flip it over to the buffer side. And a few squeaks later, and there we go. All right, not perfect, but definitely good enough to demonstrate the concept that I'm trying to illustrate here, which again is that it's really all about picking the right tool for the job, and that this is why I like to have a wide variety of sanding things at my disposal. So let me stop banging into the camera and let's take a look at all of said sanding materials. Alright, so I have this giant bag of them down here in one of my drawers, and this bag is full of UMP stuff because it really is my go-to. Honestly, the sanding instrument that I use more than anything is this 400 grit Finny stick. It just works really good in a lot of situations. The only disadvantage to it is that at 400 grit, it will clog up with paint relatively quickly, but that's not a big deal because I just put some cheapo lacquer thinner on a Q-tip and I will just clean most of that off. But when I get tired of doing it and they get too clogged up, I will just clip them off, sometimes at a useful angle, with my Xuron clippers. And that gets me a fresh tip to work with. And that's the only reason that I find that UMP sanders ever need to be replaced or anything like that. For example, I've got this 240 grit one that I guarantee you is 2 years old, probably more, and I use it. I've used it wet, I've used it dry, I've used it a lot, and hasn't degraded on me at all. So the UMP stuff is definitely my go-to, and their packaging is good. They come in a variety of grits that go from 240 to up to 1200, and then they have the polishing sticks. So 240, 400, 800, 1200, and then polishers. All right. Then I've also got some ones in here. Let's see if I can get them out. Well, you can just see them right there. Okay, these are ones that I got from Micromark, I think, at one time. I forget what the brand is. Again, they're advertising micro mesh. We've beat that horse half to death. But they do at least have the grit on there, whatever it is. I never was a big fan of them. I didn't find that they were that durable, and I didn't find, again, that the grits really made a lot of sense for me. And those were the ones that I had before I switched to using the UMP ones almost exclusively. These Stevens International ones, those were just some, I think, that are just cheapo nail files that Stevens was distributing with their name on them. Again, same thing. Did never find them to be as good as the UMP things. These Flory ones I got, I've talked a little bit about them before. I just wasn't hugely impressed. I mean, they do the job, but they're kind of packaged as a coarse, medium, and fine, and I just don't really find that classification corresponds to what I think of as coarse, medium, and fine. Like his fine seems to be about more like a 240 grit type thing. I don't know. Maybe I haven't given him a fair chance, but I just did not find, other than being really thin like this, in the case of that polisher that I showed you, that they offered any real advantage for me to cause me to want to switch over from the UMP stuff. Plus, I like Paul and supporting his stuff as well. But it wouldn't matter. If it didn't work for me, I wouldn't use it. At any rate, when it comes to sanding sticks, those UMP things have taken care of pretty much all of my needs so far. But there are situations where a sanding stick or a polisher, and or a different shaped UMP stick that they have. These are pretty cool. I'm not as big a fan of these because even though this is a 240 1200, for one thing, the fact that it's the same color on both sides, trust me, I have mistakenly hit something that I intended to use 1200 on with the 1200, with the 240 side, because I just wasn't paying enough attention. So that's one thing about this one that I don't like. But it also has a fairly firm backing on it. And so even though with this 1200 grit you get a fairly fine polish, I don't like it on paint. It just tends to be a little bit scratchy because it has a more rigid backing and just not a lot of give to it. So this one is good for like when you're dressing off the edge of a part where you've clipped a sprue gate or something like that. But I don't use this one a whole lot. Let's see. Okay, so again, they have these sponges that are the same shape. Now these sponges are pretty cool. Again, it does a little bit better job on a painted surface because it does have some give to it. That kind of addresses what I was talking about before. I still find that I just don't use this one as much because generally when I'm going to go after a painted surface, I need more coverage, except when I'm working on maybe primer. And I find that what I sand my primer with, like when I'm doing spot fills and just basic body work, I find that I go after it with this 400 grit thing the most often. And that I will, I wet sand to make it cut better and faster, keep the paper cleaner. Sometimes in those situations, if I have a lot of filler to remove, I'll start with the 240. But again, basically what I'm saying is, those things have covered just about all of my basic bodywork needs. Where I see myself using this type thing for is basically what I demonstrated on this little piece right here, where I have a large surface area that I need to cover, and that's kind of why I bought them. So if I want to polish some paint or polish an entire hunk of plastic, then something like this is going to work really well. And basically, they'll something like this will complement my my buffers from UMP. I have a lot of these, but I go through them pretty fast because they do clog up. And these you cannot clean with lacquer thinner or even water, I found out, because it basically just strips the grit right off of it. So when these start getting really clogged up and nasty and I can't clean them off on my sleeve anymore, then I end up just throwing them away. So it'll be good to have some more of those. Clearly I have enough to last me for quite a while. Now, for situations where a stick is not the right tool, there are other things that I have. I basically have this little bucket sort of various sanding supplies. These are some sponges from Micro Mark. This is like the oldest sanding tool I have. It's one of the very first things I bought. It's 240 grit. It's pretty clogged up and used up, but I still use it because it does a good job. And these are handy because they're easy to hang on to, and they obviously have a big sponge. So when that works well, then that's what you use. And what I like them for a lot is when I have weird situations like say a wing root or something that I need to get down into a corner, I will chop pieces of them off, and then I will use my gripper tweezers as a holding handle. If I can get a grip on the gripper like that, and now I can sand down inside of a crevice. Ooh, that kind of hurts. Anyway, so that's where pieces of a sponge are nice. You can use things like this similarly, because you can roll it up and fold it up. And another nice thing you can do with sponge stuff like this is you can cut thin strips of it off and use it kind of like a soft sanding belt if you need to work inside of a crevice that you can't really get to any other way. Kind of continuing with the sponge thing, you'll notice that I have these little chunks of sponges that are backed with a soft material. Now these come off of discs that are made by Abralon, and I bought a whole set of them, and they go from 500 to 4,000 grit, and you can see I cut chunks of them out. And these things are fantastic, used wet or dry. I just love them. I made myself a little sanding foot with a piece of Velcro on one side of it, so I can take these things and I write what the grit is on the back of them after I cut them off. That's a 3,000 grit. It's got a 3 on it. And I can just take and attach it to my little Velcro sanding foot, and now I've got a pretty comfortable way of being able to work on a surface like that. Works good. Now, when I'm feeling pretty aggro and I don't want to put all the elbow grease into it, I have a Proxxon Pin Sander. That is a wonderful little tool. It's like an angry little bee. It just gets buzzing back and forth at about 10 bazillion cycles per second. And you can see that I've got one of the little sanding foots with the same Velcro on it, and I can put my Abralon pads on there and I can get busy. I mean, this will smooth an entire surface down pronto. And if I want to use paper, which is another option I'll talk about, you can see I got a bunch of little chunks of paper. I use the other foot that I have double sticky tape on. I just plug it into the pin sander instead of the Velcro foot. And that gives me yet another option for motorized sanding. Okay, so that kind of covers all of the sponges. Now then, there are times when you need to do something totally different. And again, going back to what I said about how often the performance of a sanding material is determined by the grit. By the backing. Sometimes it's necessary to use it just as plain paper. But before I do that, let me dig out some other things that I've got down here. It's like almost like I collect sanding supplies. And it's good to kind of compare them and get rid of some stuff every now and then. So this is sponge material. These are from 3M, and you can see that they are labeled fine and super fine. Now, I've never been a huge fan of them because honestly, they seemed way more aggressive than advertised when I tried to use them. They're kind of stiff. You can see that when you wrinkle them, they don't just fold up the way that this stuff does from Infini. The Infini stuff is cheaper. These were kind of hard to get, and I remember paying more than I thought I should have for them, but they seemed like they should be a great option. But I just never ended up really liking them that much. This one in particular, even though it says fine, it was rough as a cob. And when you look at it, I mean, it looks more like maybe 240 than it does anything else. So you have to be careful with the nomenclature and what each manufacturer chooses to call their particular products. Then I also have some little sponges here. These are from Micro Mesh, and these are their little things. And again, with their silly grit system, 3200, which is, when you look at it, it honestly, if you take this one over here, that's 1500 grit, I would say it's kind of tough to tell the difference. And I can tell you from experience that there's not much difference. In fact, this one might be a little finer. Bottom line is, with these little micro mesh sponges, frankly, I find them useless. In fact, they are so useless that I'm going to take the opportunity to gather them up and put them where they belong, which is in the trash can. They were one of the more disappointing tools I've ever purchased. This was what I was talking about, cutting sponges into strips so that you can, you know, kind of do this type of operation with them. And there we go. All right, now getting back to papers. Okay, sometimes you have a weird situation where you need to be able to approach it differently than any of your available tools may have. And having some styrene sheet stock and some regular old papers gives you a lot of versatility. This is just a piece of 1mm evergreen with a piece of what looks to be about, 1500 grit, maybe sandpaper glued to it. And I can use that for whatever it's appropriate for. I don't know why I did it at the time. But I have this whole collection of paper, which I believe probably is the Chinese standard. This says 3000 grit. The CW thing is what makes me think it's Chinese, plus it's, you know, got dragons and stuff all over it. Wow, that might be racist, I don't know. But anyway, it is obviously a pretty fine grit. And I have a whole bag of that stuff that I have here so that I can select. See, it goes from 400 to 3000 grit. And it's got 2 or 3 sheets of each one. I got it off of Amazon. It's a pretty good value. I like it. I mean, I've had this for well over a year and I haven't used a whole lot of it. But there are times when just using a piece of folded up paper backed by your finger is absolutely the best way to go. One place where I find that to be true is when I'm polishing the orange peel out of clear coat. You need something that's kind of rigid so that it will level out the ups and downs of the orange peel, but not so rigid that it leaves scratches. And a fingertip seems to really be almost the perfect thing. Although I have done pretty well with my Abralon pads on my little pin sander. So anyway, that's a good reason to just keep some basic wet or dry sandpapers in stock. So my drawers are falling out. And I think that pretty well covers all of the sanding tools and options that I have at my bench. Okay, so there you go. I want to wrap this up as quick as I can. You can see that I can get pretty obsessive about sanding tools. I can't do a simple review of one sanding thing without talking about every other sanding thing. But look, sorry not sorry, because I really believe that they are one of the most important tools that we use. And look, maybe some of you guys don't see it that way. Maybe you don't do any sanding at all. And hey, that's fine. I mean, if that's the way you build and that gets you the results that you're after, then that's fine. But if you want a really first-class finish, you're going to have to apply some sandpaper and some elbow grease in one form or another. There's just no escaping that. So that's why I get, as I said, so obsessive about it. At any rate, I hope you found this informative and useful about this new product from Infini. I like them. I think that I'm going to be happy that I bought these. If I remember right, the combination of both the sponges and the sponge sticks together was like, I don't know, it was like, I want to say $60 for all of it, which may sound like a lot, but remember, that's 2 different product lines that I bought that Matt Bull has put together a sort of a package thing on those where you can get all of them at once without having to go through and click on each one. But you can definitely select each one individually as well, and they're less expensive. So don't feel like you have to do it the way I do it. I just, wanted the whole thing so that I could check it all out. But I like them, and I'm going to be happy that I bought them. I feel confident of that. So At any rate, as always, I hope you found this useful, and I appreciate you watching. Much love.